played trombone because they watched Star Trek and they were big fans of the show. I think gorgeous cinematography, and especially all the new Star Trek, encouraged to shoot sort of cinematically and filmically. And
Intro. It became one of the most celebrated franchises in the history of television and cinema, a vision of the future so compelling, so boldly imagined, that it changed how an entire generation thought about science, diversity, and what humanity might one day become. But the version of Star Trek that audiences fell in love with was not the version that Gene Roddenberry first tried to put on screen. Behind the polished bridge of the USS Enterprise, beneath the iconic whoosh of sliding doors and the crisp uniforms of Starfleet, lay a completely different show, one that NBC rejected outright, one that featured a different captain, a different crew, a different tone, and ideas so far ahead of their time that a television network in 1965 simply could not wrap its head around them. Beyond that, there were scenes the cameras were never meant to show, production secrets that stayed buried for decades, and on-set realities so far removed from what viewers saw on screen that they would have shattered the illusion entirely. This is the original, disturbing version of Star Trek, the one the studio erased, and the one that tells a far stranger and more fascinating story than anything that made it to air. The pilot nobody was supposed to see. On January 22, 1965, Gene Roddenberry submitted a completed pilot episode to NBC. It was called The Cage, and it bore only a passing resemblance to the Star Trek that would eventually air the following year. The captain of the Enterprise was not James T. Kirk. He was Christopher Pike, played by Hollywood actor Jeffrey Hunter, best known at the time for portraying Jesus Christ in the 1961 biblical epic King of Kings. Hunter's Pike was a fundamentally different kind of hero, quiet, introspective, burdened by the weight of command in ways that felt literary rather than cinematic. The episode's plot sent the Enterprise to the planet Talos IV, where Pike was captured by a race of powerful telepathic aliens called the Talosians, who could generate elaborate illusions and were attempting to use Pike as part of a breeding experiment to rebuild their dying civilization. The story was psychological, layered, and deeply philosophical. It was, by every measure, a serious piece of science fiction television. NBC hated it. The network's response was blunt and unambiguous: the pilot was too cerebral. Executives felt it was too slow, too intellectual, and not remotely action-packed enough to hold a mainstream audience. There was also a specific complaint about the character of Number 1, the ship's female first officer, played by Majel Barrett, who was considered too controversial for American audiences in 1965. The idea of a woman in a senior command position was, in the view of NBC's programming executives, simply too much for viewers to accept. The pilot was rejected in its entirety. Roddenberry was told to go back and start again. What happened next was genuinely extraordinary. Rather than cancel the project, NBC made a decision almost without precedent in television history at the time: they ordered a second pilot. The budget for the new attempt was cut from roughly $600,000 to $300,000, and Roddenberry was given strict instructions to make something faster, more action-driven, and more accessible. Jeffrey Hunter was offered the chance to return as Pike. He declined. In a 1965 interview with the Milwaukee Journal, Hunter explained his decision plainly, saying he had several other projects in development and did not want to be tied down to a television series for an extended period. Some accounts suggest his wife at the time also encouraged him to step away, believing that a weekly TV show was beneath his standing as a film actor. Whatever the precise reason, Hunter walked away. He passed away just 3 years later, in May 1969, at the age of 42, never knowing that the franchise he had helped launch would become one of the defining cultural phenomena of the 20th century. The rejected pilot was not wasted. Roddenberry later incorporated its footage into a 2-part first-season episode called The Menagerie, which went on to win a Hugo Award, making the rejected, too cerebral, never-broadcast pilot the foundation of award-winning television. The Cage itself did not receive an official television broadcast until 1988, more than 2 decades after it was filmed. The Captain Who Changed Everything. With Hunter gone, Roddenberry recast the lead. William Shatner, who had been working steadily in theater and television, stepped into the role that would define the rest of his career and, in many ways, define an entire era of popular culture. Where Hunter had been restrained and philosophical, Shatner was electric. His Kirk was bold, instinctive, physically dynamic, and unmistakably charismatic. The second pilot, titled Where No Man Has Gone Before, was completed in January 1966 and approved by NBC, who placed Star Trek in their fall 1966 television lineup. The entire tone of the show had shifted with the change in lead. Roddenberry's serious, thoughtful science fiction had been reshaped into something faster, louder, and more immediately engaging. Leonard Nimoy was the only cast member carried over from the original pilot. Everyone else was new. James Doohan joined as Chief Engineer Scotty. George Takei was introduced as Sulu. DeForest Kelley came aboard as Dr. Leonard McCoy. And in the first full season, Nichelle Nichols joined the crew as Lieutenant Uhura, a casting decision that would have consequences far beyond anything anyone involved could have anticipated at the time. The Doors, the ship, and the illusion. Long before a single episode aired, the production team behind Star Trek was making creative decisions born not from artistic vision but from budget reality, decisions that would ironically go on to define the look, the sound, and the feel of one of the most beloved franchises in history. The most famous example is the transporter. In Roddenberry's original conception, the Enterprise crew would travel to planets using shuttlecraft, a far more visually logical method of interplanetary transport. But filming shuttlecraft landings and approach sequences for every episode would have required exterior shots, elaborate sets, and considerably more time and money than a weekly television production could sustain. The solution was the transporter effect, a simple technique in which sparkling material was filmed falling against a dark background, then the footage was reversed and layered with light effects. The entire illusion was achieved at a tiny fraction of what planetary shuttle sequences would have cost. The result was so visually striking and conceptually fascinating that it became one of the most iconic images in science fiction history. Physicists have been debating the theoretical possibility of teleportation ever since, and experiments inspired by the concept have been conducted at universities around the world. All of it traces back to a budget problem on a 1960s television set. The famous sliding doors of the Enterprise presented a different kind of behind-the-scenes reality. On screen, they opened with a smooth, instantly recognizable whoosh, a sound that became as synonymous with Star Trek as the theme music itself. In practice, the doors were anything but smooth. The actual mechanism on set was loud, clunky, and thoroughly unfuturistic. The noise was so significant that it regularly drowned out the actors' dialogue. The production response was a quiet workaround that audiences almost certainly never noticed. Characters almost never speak while those doors are in motion. If you go back and watch closely, there is a distinctive pause before and after each door opens or closes. Actors would hold their lines, wait for stagehands to complete the sequence, and then continue speaking, allowing editors to cut out the mechanical clatter and replace it in post-production with the smooth whoosh that became iconic. The USS Enterprise herself had her own hidden secret. The 11-foot filming model used to represent the ship was extraordinarily detailed, but only on the surfaces that would ever appear on camera. The top of the saucer section, the nacelles, the upper hull, all meticulously painted and finished. The underside, however, was largely left incomplete, rough in places and far less refined. Since every shot was framed from above or the side, there was simply no budget and no need to finish areas that would never be seen. That original model is now preserved in the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. The unfinished underside of one of the most famous vehicles in storytelling history is right there, hidden in plain sight, for anyone who knows to look for it. Nichelle Nichols and the Conversation That Changed Television. When Star Trek premiered on NBC on September 8, 1966, Nichelle Nichols was already doing something quietly revolutionary simply by being present on screen. As Lieutenant Uhura, she portrayed one of the first black women in a prominent, non-servant role in the history of American mainstream television. Uhura was not background decoration. She was a senior officer, an essential member of the crew, someone with authority and professional dignity at the highest levels of a fictional military and exploratory organization. After the first season concluded in 1967, Nichols made the decision to leave. Broadway was calling, and she had submitted her resignation to Gene Roddenberry. Then something happened that she could not have anticipated. At an NAACP fundraiser in Los Angeles, she encountered Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who asked to speak with her. King told Nichols that she must not leave. He told her that Uhura was more than a character, that for the first time, young black children could turn on a television set and see someone who looked like them serving as an officer, a professional, a person of dignity and intelligence in a vision of the future. He told her she had changed the face of television and that the door she had opened must not be allowed to close. He described himself and his family as devoted fans of the show. The following day, Nichols withdrew her resignation. She remained with Star Trek for the entirety of its original run, appeared in the animated series, and starred in 6 feature films. Her continued presence on the show later influenced Mae Jemison, the first black female astronaut, who has cited Uhura as a direct inspiration for her decision to pursue a career in space. The kiss NBC tried to prevent. On November 22, 1968, in an episode called Plato's Stepchildren, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura shared a kiss on screen, widely considered the first lip-to-lip kiss between a white man and a black woman ever broadcast on American primetime television. The episode's plot provided a carefully constructed buffer. Aliens with psychokinetic powers were forcing the Enterprise crew to perform against their will, which meant the kiss was technically involuntary, allowing NBC to argue that the moment did not represent a freely chosen romantic encounter. The network's concern was entirely focused on its southern affiliates, who it feared would refuse to air an episode depicting an interracial kiss. NBC executives pushed hard for an alternative version of the